Ahead of the release of Dynasty Warriors Origins on January 17th, 2025, Koei Tecmo has just released another Three Kingdoms game called Romance of the Three Kingdoms 8 Remake, or just 8 Remake as I'll call it in this video. 8 Remake is out right now on PC, PlayStation consoles, and Switch. Now if you didn't know, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, or ROTK video game series, is essentially the strategy game version of Dynasty Warriors. It has all of the same characters as Dynasty Warriors, plus thousands more. ROTK has been around for almost 40 years, and as you can guess, 8 Remake is a remake of the original ROTK 8, released 23 years ago back in 2001. Now if you aren't familiar with Dynasty Warriors or ROTK, these games take place during the Three Kingdoms period of ancient China, which was essentially a very long civil war. So today we're going to take a look at 8 Remake to see if it's worth your time and if it's actually an improvement over the original game. As such, I'll obviously be comparing the two games to each other here and there. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Koei Tecmo for giving me access to this game a few days early so I could get this review out to you all as soon as possible. So starting up the game, the presentation is immediately fantastic. The music and art are both beautiful. If you're a fan of the original 8, there's also an option to switch the music back to the classic soundtrack, but the remade music sounded pretty faithful to the original, so I didn't see any need to do that myself. You also have the option to create your own character and even upload custom images for your character's portrait. The character creation is pretty standard, but there is a ton of great looking character art already there to choose from. Now while the art itself is really good, there is one artistic choice in this game that is a little uncanny. For some reason, they decided to add motion to the still character portraits. I think just having a breathing animation would be fine, but when their eyes and mouths move, it just makes me a little bit uncomfortable. It reminds me of those memes a while back where AI would animate a character's face to look like it's singing. It's easy to ignore, but I'm not sure why they would ruin amazing character art like that. Anyways, moving on to the game itself, you first have to choose a character to play as and a scenario to play them in. There are literally thousands of characters to play as in this game, each with their own art, stats, and oftentimes relationships. You can choose to play as some of the most famous officers of the time period like Lu Bu or Guan Yu, or you can play as a super obscure officer with terrible starting stats if you wanted to. The game of course recommends starting as a famous character, and they tend to have really great stats. Before choosing a character, it's also important to know what rank your character will start out as. Your character can be a free officer who doesn't work for a faction yet, a common officer which is the lowest rank of a kingdom, a tactician who is an advisor to someone in a higher position, a governor who is in charge of a single city, a viceroy who is in charge of multiple cities, and finally a ruler who is in charge of the entire faction. Outside of a typical rank, you can also be a chieftain or a comrade who are part of a faction that has no territory to rule over. Throughout the game, your rank will most likely change, so you do have the option to start from a common officer and then work your way up to a higher position, which is what I decided to do. The game also features over 50 scenarios, which is essentially the year that you start out in. For the most part, each scenario features different main characters and faction locations. Most of the scenarios are historically accurate, but there are a number of fictional scenarios that you can unlock also. So I decided, in honor of Zhao Yun no longer being the main character of Dynasty Warriors, I would play as him in the year 194 scenario. Eight Remake is broken into two main gameplay phases. The first phase is Parliament. Parliament is where most of the actual strategic aspect of the game takes place. During Parliament, you can perform various plots to sabotage other factions, engage in diplomacy, manage your faction's staff, and of course, attack other cities. The actions that you can perform in Parliament change slightly depending on your rank, and for certain actions you do have to ask your ruler for approval. I never had a suggestion get denied in 8 Remake, but I'm sure it can happen since it could in the original 8. Parliament is also where tasks are assigned to officers for the next 3 months, since Parliament happens with each season change. This brings us to the other phase of the game, which I'll call the town phase. This is where you'll spend a majority of your time in the game. During the town phase, you can choose to do quite a few different things. During my time as a common officer, my number one priority was to complete my tasks. Tasks are essentially the way that you develop your city and include things like agriculture, commerce, and public order. Depending on your character stats and skills, your character will be better at some tasks as opposed to others. With Zhao Yun being an amazing general, he was best at raising public order, but a smarter character like Zhuge Liang would be better at commerce. Successfully completing your tasks gives you merit, which is how you rank up in your faction. While in town, you can also complete requests at the tavern. Fulfilling requests can boost your martial and cultural reputation as well as your notoriety. These determine how famous your character is, and you need a specific level of fame to complete certain tales. I'll get more details in a second. You are also able to inquire at different locations around your town, which raises the public's attitude towards you. You also need a specific public attitude to do certain tales. So tales are essentially the game's events, and they can be a major event or a minor event. For example, Zhao Yun has his own tale that involves him leaving his current faction to go work with Liu Bei. Most of the historical and major tales don't really involve your character directly though, and instead they change the world around you, such as a tale where Yuan Shu declares himself emperor and turns all of the other factions against him. All of the more minor tales do affect your character though, like sometimes you might go hunt bandits or meet different women that you can then marry. Tales also don't trigger automatically. You get to pick and choose what tales you would like to do whenever you want, although some are on a time limit. So aside from tasks and tales, the other major part of 8 Remake is your relationship with other officers. A good amount of your game will involve building relationships because they're pretty beneficial. Your relationships with other officers can change in many different ways. Oftentimes you will run into officers while doing your tasks and have conversations with them. There are a good amount of random events in this game that will have you interact with other officers, but after a few hours of playing, you do get a lot of repeats which I just started to skip. You can also visit officers and speak with them and give them gifts. Interacting with officers enough can gain you sympathy with them. If you gain sympathy 4 times with an officer and raise their level of trust, you can then give them a symbol of friendship which makes them devoted to you. Devoted officers are great to have because they'll help you with tasks and you'll be able to perform strong link attacks with them in battles too. The number of devoted officers that you can have is limited though, so I tried to make sure to only have devoted relationships with especially talented officers. In my playthrough, I even had Zhao Yun become sworn siblings with Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei, which was great because I often had them in the same city as me and helping me out. It's also important to note that you aren't just stuck to being in one single town either. You do have the freedom to travel to other towns, interact with their officers, and do requests in their tavern. This is good to do if you've done everything that you can or want to do in your own town. Certain tales will also require you to go exploring into different towns to complete them. I think that's a good overview of the Parliament and town phases. Compared to the original 8, I think the remake definitely improves on this part of the game. Not only is everything in the remake more streamlined than the original, the tales and random events add a decent amount of variety to the game so you aren't doing the exact same thing every single turn like you tend to do in the original game. I won't say though that this part of the game isn't repetitive. I was able to play about 8 hours of the game before making this video, and I did feel like I had seen all of the random events just a few hours in, along with all of the generic and repeating tales. Before we get into the game's combat or battles, I would like to talk about 8 Remake's 2 minigames, duels and debates. Duels and debates will often happen during tales, but they pop up in other places too, most notably being duels happening during battles themselves. Unlike past ROTK games, duels and debates are done in very similar, if not identical, minigames. At the start of a duel or debate, the officer with better stats first gets a free hit on the other officer. After that, you have 5 turns to try and either drain your opponent's entire health bar, or make sure that you have the higher health bar than them. In the beginning, you start off with 4 different actions that each have a number associated with them aside from the special action. In order to play actions, you must either play actions that are all the same number or at least 3 different numbers in a row. For example, in my first duel, I played 2 5s and a special and won the duel in the first turn. And for example, I could not have played the 1 along with the 5s because they aren't the same number and they aren't in a row. And then in my first debate, I was able to play 2, 3, and 4 because they are 3 numbers in a row. If I had 2, 3, and 5, I wouldn't be able to play them at all. Duels and debates can be fairly challenging, especially against an opponent with equal or higher stats than you. You have to decide whether you want to save your numbers for a strong combo or get in as many hits as you can right away. Either way is a gamble since you have no idea what actions you'll get after your next turn. And if your opponent plays better actions than you, they get to hit you and you're gonna do no damage against them. Compared to past ROTK games, I think the duel and debate minigame might be my favorite out of the entire series. I honestly wish I got to do them more often, but the opportunities I got were fairly sparse. So the last important part of the game to cover are the battles themselves. Now for me personally, the battles were one of the worst parts of the original 8. They were just really slow and honestly really ugly to look at. Every battle just looked cramped and kind of made me feel claustrophobic. Battles in 8 Remake are done much better in my opinion. They're fairly simple and don't take too long to get through. When you decide to march against an enemy or you're on defense, which is something I never experienced in my 8 hours of playing somehow, you choose what officers you want to bring into battle with you and what unit type they'll be. The game does automatically put together an army for you, but do not trust what they give you unless you're absolutely sure you know what you're up against. The computer will sometimes give you an army that does not at all match the enemy army once you add in the enemy reinforcements. The game put me in a really bad situation once, and I ended up getting outnumbered by tens of thousands of enemy reinforcements. Once your army is set and you decide to control the battle yourself, you're taken to the battlefield. There's a short setup phase where you'll choose where you want your units to start and what stratagems you'll bring, which are essentially powerful abilities to help you in the battle. Once the battle starts, the combat itself is turn-based. As an attacker, the main things you need to worry about besides the enemy are the archer towers placed around and hidden traps. Both can do serious damage if you don't navigate them well. In order to win the battle, you either need to wipe out the defending enemy officers, not including their reinforcements, or just destroy their castle. I never brought any siege weapons to a battle, so I always found it easier to just eliminate all the enemy officers. Like I said, the battles are pretty straightforward. You want to try to use your officers' abilities and stratagems wisely and keep your devoted officers nearby to perform powerful link attacks. From my experience, battles can be pretty tough. In previous ROTK games, if you had the better war officers, you would easily sweep through worse officers, but that wasn't the case here. Obviously, you would have an advantage, but troop count and tactics play a huge role in battles too. So that's pretty much the game. Overall, 8 Remake is a better game than the original 8, but in my opinion, some of original 8's issues still linger in the remake. The first issue is that I felt the pacing of the campaign was pretty slow, just what I experienced in the original 8. It could have just been my specific situation, but the area that my faction was in was basically in a stalemate for a long time. Essentially, Liu Bei and Lu Bu kept forming alliances, and Cao Cao and Yuan Shao kept forming alliances. This meant that Cao Cao or Yuan Shao couldn't attack because either Liu Bei or Lu Bu would get reinforcements from the other, and then vice versa on the other side. I did manage to attack and defeat Cao Cao on 2 separate occasions, since either the alliance between him and Yuan Shao had elapsed, or his territory was too far from Yuan Shao. Like I mentioned before, neither of them even attempted to attack Liu Bei, even when they had a really clear advantage. This made progression painfully slow, and I felt like after 7 or 8 hours, I hardly had made any progress at all. Again, I doubt every playthrough would go like this, but to be honest, no faction had made a ton of progress in my playthrough, with the exception of factions who were just taking up empty space. That being said, the gameplay of just living my life as an officer was enjoyable enough to offset the slow-moving territory progression. I also do think I would have been able to move the game along faster if I had been a ruler or a viceroy, but I was only able to reach the rank of governor as Zhao Yun. The only other real negative of the game is probably the lack of variety in the generic events that happen. As I mentioned earlier, I think you might find yourself skipping through them just a few hours into the game. So, is Romance of the Three Kingdoms 8 Remake worth your time? For fans of the ROTK series, or probably even the Three Kingdoms in general, I would say yes. I would consider it a top 5 ROTK game, but I wouldn't quite call it the best one. Now for those of you interested in getting into Romance of the Three Kingdoms, $60 USD may be a little bit of a steep price tag, but 8 Remake is certainly a good stepping point into the series. If you're interested in Dynasty Warriors or Three Kingdoms content, you should consider subscribing since I will very soon be releasing my video playing through every ROTK game, and in January I will be playing and making videos on Dynasty Warriors Origins like crazy. Have you ever played ROTK, or does it look interesting enough for you to try? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.